Hey, well, whether it's a domestic violence situation or any kind of traumatic event, when there's a crisis, there has to be a response. One of the things that research has found is that there's 4 primary phases of a crisis. And you'll see this as you're working with people, and you might potentially enter into a relationship with someone at almost any of these 4 stages, but typically, especially if you're a part of a domestic violence or a trauma outreach team, you will probably enter a relationship at or shortly after the impact phase. That is phase number 1, impact. That is, something happens. It's sudden, it's unexpected, it's normally traumatic and painful. It could be, again, such as a car accident or the loss of a loved one. But the initial impact is powerful and it is life-changing. So when someone has a crisis that happens to them, it will affect how they think, how they feel, often in ways that are a little disturbing in some sense, but also in ways that are not necessarily common to that individual. In other words, you might find someone that naturally is very confident and becomes extremely withdrawn. Another person that tends to be quiet and becomes extremely animated. The impact phase doesn't last a long period of time, normally for a few moments or could be a few hours. Often, one of the things we are concerned about is shock, to make sure that someone is not so traumatized that their systems, their bodily systems begin to shut down. We want to make sure that they're cared for, and typically first responders are the ones that take care of those kinds of things. You would come along as a domestic violence counselor, so if this is a situation where someone has been battered, they've been thrown out of the house, or some other type of crisis related to domestic violence occurs, perhaps a child abuse situation has been reported, the impact of that, what does it mean for them? How do I recover? What do I do now? These are all typical questions that they have in that initial impact phase. Often what we see is then withdrawal or confusion. In other words, the result of the trauma, I was going down the road, I was moving in a direction, life seemed to be okay, and then a suddenly happens. Well, this suddenly may, as you look back at it, may not be that suddenly. It may be one of several things that have built up and now has finally erupted. But to the individual experiencing it, it is a suddenly experience. And often they want to withdraw, and what comes with it is a sense of confusion. I'm not sure where I'm at. My orientation in terms of my life circumstances has radically changed. I'll give you just a simple example. I remember when I was playing baseball years ago at San Diego State, I was trying to steal second base. The catcher from the opposing team threw the ball, and it hit me right in the head. Now, some people believe that that's one of the reasons I'm still a little bit off kilter to this day, but the fact is, it did ring my bell. It hit me, just off the temple area. My coach, came out. I told him, leave me alone, get away from me. I was confused, I was disoriented, and then I realized I'm probably not going to die. I got back on second base, and I think I scored. But anyway, life went on. But the initial impact was shock. I wasn't expecting to be hit by a baseball thrown at about 100 miles an hour. But at the same time, fortunately, because of probably a hard head, the impact didn't last long, but the initial withdrawal and the initial confusion was definitely there, even in that little incident. Well, you can think if you're involved in a marriage and family life and suddenly, even though there may have been a long build up to it and many smaller incidences of neglect or abuse, and then boom, there's a battering incident. Well, for the person that has been battered and also for the person that did the battering, there is a withdrawal, a time of confusion that can be devastating for them. And often that's when you're called upon to step in there, to be with them in the midst of that confusion. One of the things we'll talk about a little later is kind of the ministry of presence. That is simply just being with people, not necessarily trying to answer questions or come up with solutions for them. Just being with them, listening to them is one of the greatest gifts you can provide as they begin to work through their own confusion. The third then is adjustment. I mean, after a crisis happens, whether it's again a domestic violence case or whatever, they will begin to adjust to what becomes then a new normal for them. That adjustment can take moments, it can take days, weeks, months, even years for some people. I mean, we've seen, for instance, in grief and loss that there seems to be kind of a general time frame that the longer you've been married, the longer it takes, assuming it was a reasonably good marriage, for recovery to happen or for the adjustment to come. And so we kind of look at, for every 5 years of marriage, there's about a year that it takes to really deal with the issue of loss and withdrawal and all that goes with it, before you come to a place of full acceptance and you're ready to enter into another relationship. So if you've been married for 50 years, you can see why many people after that period of time, they're not interested in getting married right away. Or if they do get married right away, oftentimes it's a bit disastrous because they've never finished the grieving process. So we'll talk more about grief and loss in just a bit. So the adjustment phase is when they're trying to figure out, now what? Now that this has happened, now what do I do? How do I look at my life? How do I respond to my spouse? How do I deal with the trauma or the crisis that I've experienced? And then ultimately it's reconstruction or reconciliation. That is trying to not just make sense, not just adjust to it, but really come to a place of acceptance, we hope, or readjustment to the circumstance or situation. You know, along with the 4 phases of crisis is what we call the ABCD crisis model, or how do you intervene with someone in the midst of a crisis? Well, you know, all counseling, whether it's domestic violence counseling or just really just being a close friend, it all requires relationship. So the A and the ABCD is achieve a relationship. And some of us are more skilled at developing a relationship quickly than others. It was said of our former President Bill Clinton that for the 15 seconds that you were with him and he was with you. That he had this unique gift to connect with people quickly, not necessarily deeply, but quickly, where they felt like that he was really listening to them. Whether he was or not is another story, but the ability to connect with people, to somehow let them know that you're there, that you're with them, that you care about them, is vitally important. I mean, we try and use the term, you have to trust me that I am able to help you. Well, how are they going to trust you? They don't know who you are. But, if you're trained, if you're certified, if you have certain status, it's easier for me, for instance, because I'm a doctor. And doctors are generally trusted. Often a first responder, they're going to trust them, at least in the area of their expertise. And they'll most likely listen to them and follow their instructions. But however you do it, you have to somehow connect with people and achieve a relationship. The B then stands for boil down the problem. In other words, there's the problem, and there's the problem, and there's the problem. I mean, there's often a stated problem. That is, this is what the person thinks is the crisis in their life, and it may be something different, but whatever it is that they present, it is the problem. We're not looking for some deeper thing, especially in the early stage of a crisis. So if we're talking about domestic violence, which we are, It's that the problem is you've just been battered, or you've just been bruised in some way, you've been neglected, you've been controlled or manipulated, and you finally became aware that this is not healthy. So somehow this thing has become a real open issue. And so boiling the problem down, you're a victim of, it's been perpetrated by, it's kind of simple. It's boiling it down to the simple components so that they can grasp what really has happened to them. It's not a time to look deeply into their psyche or try and determine if they have a long history. You'll get to that. But in the beginning, it's build the relationship and try and narrow the problem down to the most important issue. I was a professor, was quite brilliant professor. He was a chief of chaplains with the United States Army in Missouri, where I was stationed. And he was teaching a master's level class in the area of crisis and crisis counseling. And he used an illustration of essentially boiling down the problem. And this one really kind of stuck with me. He said there was a young man that had called a crisis hotline. And the young man gave him his first name and said, I've got a gun. I think it was like a .357 Magnum or something like that. And I've got it pointed at my head and I'm going to kill myself. Well, that is quite a crisis. And the counselor said, well, tried to get him to talk and, please don't do that. And, life, it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem is killing yourself. But he got him to tell his story, and he said, well, my wife left me, kind of like a country western song. My wife left me, my dog left me, everyone's left me, and now I can't pay my electric bill, and I'm going to have to be kicked out of my own house. I have no way of paying my bills. A very clever counselor on the other end said, well, what's in your hand? And the young man said, well, I've got, this gun. I said, well, what do you think it's worth? I said, well, $500, $600, $700. How much is your electric bill? A couple, $300. I said, well, why don't you sell your gun and then pay your bill and then let's meet and let's talk. I mean, he boiled the problem. The problem was, I can't pay the electric bill. That was the bottom line for this young man. So helping to find a quick solution to that, at least bought him an extra day. We don't know if it bought him a long-term, health and got through the crisis, but it got him through the day. So when you're boiling the problem down, you're trying to simplify down to what's the bottom issue? What's the thing that we have to solve this moment? Not what we have to deal with 5 days from now, 5 weeks, 5 months, 5 years. What do we need to deal with today? And then challenge to constructive action is the C. In other words, you want to challenge them to do something that's going to bring about movement in a healthy direction. So, and that could be as simple as, again, sell the gun. It could be as simple as, listen, we're going to pack a bag and we're going to get you to a safe place. Are you willing to do that? And again, when you're working with people, you don't want to take away their power. You want to empower them. So you ultimately want to set things in motion where they make their own choices, their own decisions. You don't want to make decisions for them. Now, again, we're talking about in your role as a caregiver, as a domestic violence counselor, as a trauma specialist, your job is to help them to make choices. Now, again, if you're a first responder and you're stepping into a situation that's dangerous, you're not going to ask for the opinion of the people around you. You're going to just tell people, get, move, do it now or else, because that's the responsibility of the first responder. But in the responsibility of a caregiver, it's to come alongside the individual and to try and help empower them as much as possible. So we challenge them, and again, this is where some interpersonal skills are helpful. We want to challenge them. You have to be sensitive, use your wit a little bit to get them to make a choice to move off their dime and move in a healthy direction. And then the fourth thing then is to develop an ongoing plan of action. Now that ongoing plan of action, again, may be simply, we're going to get out of this situation and move you to a safe house, and then we'll meet again tomorrow. That's a simple but clear plan of action. Longer term, it's what are we going to do in terms of children? What are we going to do in terms of living arrangement and how to make a living? And all of those other things become a part of a longer term action plan. But as you can see, you want to start with the most critical things first and then slowly build on that little by little foundation and take one step at a time to help them to move in a healthy direction. So from a counseling viewpoint then, if you've boiled the situation down, you've done your ABCDs, you're aware of kind of where they're at in this traumatic response, are they in withdrawal or whatever, then you begin the process of developing kind of a treatment focus. There's not a whole lot of diagnosis you need to do. Bad diagnosis is bad treatment. Good diagnosis leads to good treatment. The diagnosis is they've been traumatized. They've been victimized. That is the initial diagnosis. And so you're not looking again for, are they clinically depressed or, those things come out down the road and with probably higher level of trained professional working with them. But you can still get some sense or move them in the direction of healthy treatment or healthy choices. And there's a little acronym we use for this called SOAP, which is Self-Other Assessment Plan. Self-Other Assessment Plan. So in other words, as you're in this initial phase of getting to know them and hearing their story, you want to be aware not just of what they're saying, but you want to be aware of yourself. How are you experiencing them? Because that's a very important measure of probably how other people experience them as well. In other words, you want to monitor some of your own feelings, some of your reactions. Does it pass a sniff test? Is this the story that I'm being told? Does it seem real and feasible? Now again, not everybody is in fact, most people are doing the best they can to share their story, to try and determine a healthy direction for their own life. They're doing the best they can in their own elegant style. But still, there's some people that are trying to just get over on others, and they don't always tell the full story, let alone the full truth. And so be aware of how you're feeling, how you're responding. Again, it's just one piece of information, but it could be a very important piece of information. Certain questions that come into your mind, you don't necessarily want to ask them right away, but you may want to jot them down to ask them later because things don't seem to jive. The story doesn't seem to be complete. Now, in the midst of crisis, that's not unusual. It very well may be the trauma or the crisis itself that's caused such confusion that the way they're sharing their story doesn't make a lot of sense. That's okay to be aware of as well. Gee, if I'm feeling confused, I can't seem to follow the story, well, what do you think's going on inside their head? So that's part of what that self is about, your own awareness of your thoughts, your feelings, etc. And then the other really speaks about our observation. Observe them. Don't just listen. Listening is important, especially a more active listening model. But observe. Are they disheveled? Do they seem, are they laughing in the midst of telling the story about something very painful and traumatic? Now again, that may be simply a nervous reaction, an anxiety-rooted reaction to their problem, but it also could mean that there's something not quite right going on with them. It's, again, to be aware of it. So you're aware of yourself and your own reactions, but you're also observing. You want to, are they oriented to time, place, and person? Do they know where they are? Do they know what time it is, what day it is? Do they know that they've had an accident or they've been abused? Do they know who they are and do they know some basic events? If they don't, then there's probably some more going on in them than just the trauma itself. Or it could indicate that the trauma has caused maybe even a deeper difficulty in their life, meaning that you may need to refer them again to a higher level professional. Then the assessment is you kind of stop and think about your thinking, think about what you've observed, think about what you've heard, and try and determine what does it all mean. Again, in most cases, it's relatively simple. It's a domestic violence case. The person has been abused. They've been kicked out of their house, or they've had to leave their home. So their whole world has been turned upside down by this event. I mean, that's a decent assessment. You don't need all clinical terms or anything like that. It's just more of a summary of your own thinking and what you've observed and what you've been told and what you've learned through an interview process or just listening to the person share their story. Again, when you're with them, you're trying to show empathy and warmth and respect, etc., as you're listening to the story, but at the same time, in the kind of the back of your head, you're thinking, I wonder what this means, I wonder what that means, and you're doing a bit of an assessment. And then from that, you develop some sort of a plan. So the plan is continued counseling, or the plan is to get into a domestic violence group, or the plan is that they're going to have to find some other place to live. So we're going to have to get a list of people to call, and so the plan kind of ferrets out over time as you get to know the person and as you learn the full circumstances of the trauma that they've experienced. Now, in most crisis situations, especially in domestic violence, we're not talking about just an individual. Someone didn't wake up and punch themselves. They had a relationship of some sort, and so often there's distressed marriages that we're stepping into, that we're observing, and that we're trying to give some sort of help to. So assessment when you're dealing with an individual is one thing. It's their story. They're going to tell it any way they want to. You can it's a little more of a straight line to determine what's happening in their life and what directions to take from here. But when you're dealing with either a couple or a full family, the dynamics of that assessment process is much more significant. And so, for instance, assessment is the process of describing the interaction between the client or clients and the obstacle or the situation that they have found themselves in. So assessment must broaden, our perspective to not just an individual, but to the roles and how people interact with each other, and how boundaries have been violated in this domestic violence situation. And so part of the goal, if you will, is to help the couple, if they're able to communicate, if there's a possibility of them getting back together, if you will. There's certain things that you're looking for, certain things that have to be assessed, safety plans have to be in place in order to be able to help them in a healthy way. So one of the goals is to help them to communicate more clearly, directly, and using words rather than actions. So it's to build a couple's communication skills, and there's a kind of a fairly simple process that you can help them. It starts with the ability to listen. In other words, what we find in most domestic violence cases is people cross-talk, they talk over each other. There's a lot of passive-aggressive communication. They're saying one thing and doing something else. Or there's just a lot of venom and anger directed at each other. And so they don't know how to listen in a healthy way. And so part of helping someone, if you're stepping into a crisis situation with a couple that maybe has had a minor battering or pushing or verbal abuse situation, when you step into the middle of that, the goal is to get them to sit down and try and listen to each other. And that often has to be modeled. So often in the beginning, instead of having them talk directly to each other, which is the longer term goal, I have them talk through an intermediary, which is me. So I will have them communicate to me, and then I will communicate to them and kind of be that middle person in the beginning, and then try and demonstrate a healthier way to listen and to respond. Because not only is it just listening, but it's then constructive request making is kind of a part of the communication process. So learning how to ask in a healthy way for what they need is an important part, because in most cases, each partner feels as though they've been taken advantage of. Each partner believes that they're the victim, and neither of which knows how, in most cases, to constructively ask for the things that they legitimately need. And so teaching them how to listen, how to ask things clearly, to selectively and in a timely way give feedback, to learn to clarify, to express themselves in a healthy, positive way, how to do things like take time out when they need to. All of that are things that we try and teach people when they're not quite to the level where there's been a big explosion, or after the determination has been made, we're going to try and put the relationship back together. So you have to be able to assess, are they able to communicate with each other in a healthy, effective way? Now, when you're dealing with domestic violence, you're dealing usually with couples. You're dealing with families. You have children involved. And so the overall assessment, I mean, you're a part of a team, and often there'll be other people involved, again, police officers or social workers, probation officers, parole officers in some cases. So you're a part of a team, and as such, you're gathering information, and you want to be able to try and understand what's really going on that's triggering the anger, the responses, the negativity within the family. That takes a lot of work, and it takes a real commitment. And anyway, we're going to talk more about some of those things and some techniques to use in working with people in the midst of domestic violence in our next session.